I'm very excited to introduce our next guest, Dr. Dane Fliedner. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, today we're going to talk about, a lot of families are confused on, does their child have autism? They haven't got the diagnosis yet. They might be seeing symptoms maybe emerge they've heard about that could be autism. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and we're going to talk about, okay, now they have the diagnosis, what are the first steps they should take? Before we do, though, can we talk about why you're so passionate about helping the autism community?
Sure. So first of all, I'm a general pediatrician, and I got involved with autism a number of years ago because I was doing integrative medicine and I was having increasing families coming in, and with the just absolute epidemic that we're going through and just seeing these children suffering and the families suffering, I really felt like it was my obligation to sort of learn more, because in our pediatrics training we get no training whatsoever into any of the reasons for autism, or let alone anything to do about it. So most of us don't know any more about it or didn't know any more about it than any of the parents that we had. And so it's been very exciting for me to be able to have tools to offer to families to help their kids get better and look for and treat some underlying imbalances that might be driving some of the symptoms that they have.
And so now let's say somebody, they're looking at their child, maybe their child was talking and then their child stopped talking, or maybe their child never even had any type of vocabulary, or maybe they weren't really looking or pointing, but they don't really know. It's kind of like, do they have autism? I'm not sure, they're really young. What are some of the symptoms that, we need to look out for, or signs?
Yeah. So it's actually, I'm probably in a unique position, even compared to many of the other doctors that are here to kind of discuss this, because not only do I do the biomedical aspect of autism treatment, but I actually do an integrative pediatric primary care practice. And so it's an opportunity for me to really watch kids coming from birth and newborns all the way up. And so a lot of kids will do a number of things that parents will take out of context, and they'll worry that their kid is maybe going onto the autism spectrum. Maybe the child is flapping, maybe the child is tippy-toe walking, or some of these things, or maybe there's a speech delay. And so what we try to do is identify those sort of maybe slight abnormalities, but there can be neurotypical kids that will do those too. But for me, the thing that makes me the most worried about it, and in fact my own nephew, recently I diagnosed informally as autistic, and he's only about 14, 15 months old, and we were catching on to this about 6 months. And really what it comes down to, in my humble opinion, is that lack of the social communication. The baby's not responding to the mom. My nephew, for example, I would be in his face and he would look beyond me at the ceiling fan or at curtains or things like this. And so I think that's the big red flag for me personally, is if I'm seeing that, I can deal with speech delays and I can deal with other things, but when I see that, that's really the red flag for me that we're maybe going towards this diagnosis.
And then, so let's say somebody, their child's 11 months, 12 months. That's typically when you're seeing kids, starting to walk and they're pointing and they're doing other stuff, right? And all of a sudden your child's not really doing that. But everybody might say, oh, they're just a late, bloomer, or boys develop later, or they don't have siblings. I've heard, trust me, I've heard all of this stuff.
Right.
Although our son was developing and we lost all that at 15 months. But let's say they're not developing. Where do they go? Like, do they go to their typical pediatrician or what?
Yeah. So certainly I see that a lot, and I hear those stories a lot where people will be coming into me for a consult, and I'll hear the stories where, oh, it's just because it's a bilingual household. Oh, because he's a boy. There's these very sort of excuses, and certainly there are those kids that will have no speech, and then all of a sudden it's 3-word sentences. And so it's always a difficult balance, because as a pediatrician you don't want to over-refer and you don't want to cause fear in a family. But at the same time, I think it's better to me to err on the side of caution. So if a parent has concern, and in fact a lot of the developmental screens that have come out over recent years actually are all about parent questions, not so much about in-office, because children can behave a certain way in the office, and the pediatrician, especially in the conventional practice where they're in 7-10 minutes, can miss delays. And so I think if a mother has, especially a mom, has a concern about their kid, because you can't help but compare as a mom, that's just the nature of doing it, I think you bring it early to the pediatrician's attention. And if the pediatrician or your family doctor is not taking it seriously, then I think you need to get a second opinion. And whether that becomes through your local regional center and getting an evaluation, a school district if they're up 3 years plus, requesting a developmental behavioral pediatrician evaluation, getting a secondary opinion I think is really important. And then that way they can at least start to evaluate some of those core symptoms, and then maybe depending on the age of the child and the needs, can start plugging them into the appropriate therapies.
And now, okay, so that's wonderful. So now families right now, they know that they don't have to wait to a certain age.
No.
I remember when my son was 15 months and losing his skills, I was trying, to find anybody, and I didn't know where to go at first. So I'd first gone to a speech language person thinking, well, maybe that's what I need to do. And they were like, oh, he probably doesn't have autism. I remember them saying that. Then I went to a neurologist, and the neurologist was like, oh, he's too young. We need to put him in some mommy and me groups. I'm sure he's fine. Because I remember there was an outlet and the doctor had said, no, don't touch that. And he listened. And apparently that meant he didn't have autism in her mind, which was not the case, And so we did eventually find regional, and that is what helped us, finally get the diagnosis. But it seemed as though I shouldn't have had to wait that 1.5 years. It took 1.5 years to get that. So I love now that, there's so much more help out there than there was, 15 plus years ago when I was on my journey, or beginning my journey with my son. And so before, they didn't really want to diagnose anything with autism, anything with a diagnosis, I should say. They didn't want to give your child any of that unless they were a little over 2.5, because they felt like even that, like he got diagnosed at 2 years, 4 months, and that was considered young.
Right.
But today, that's not the case. I see people that are 15 months, 18 months being diagnosed.
Yeah. Well, I think the awareness is a lot more, obviously, because it's become such an epidemic. And like I said, most of us that came up, let's say a generation ago in terms of our medical training, I had never seen an autistic kid in my residency.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, not that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I think there's a lot of just ignorance in many cases, and I think then the mainstream medical community has struggled to keep up because it's just growing so fast, and no one really has a lot of clean answers, and so then there's just a lot of just misunderstanding, and then no one really wants to be that person to diagnose something. That's a huge blow, obviously, to those families, that diagnosis, and so you don't want to level a heavy diagnosis on someone unless you're pretty sure, and I think so. There in that defense, I suppose. There probably is an aspect of that like, look, I want to make sure that I'm really, really sure before I give this heavy diagnosis to this family. It's not something to be taken lightly, and I think not traumatizing people that way as well. So it's trying to find that fine line, and that's always tough. I think all of us struggle with that.
Absolutely. And I think also people think, oh, well, my son might be looking or my daughter might be looking. They're not really talking, but they sure play well, but they're not understanding that parallel play is not the same as actually playing with, children. So I think those signs also, and always when in doubt, find a specialist. And I think that's, if you have a doubt or that little red flag or that little thing in your tummy, which I think all of us families who have children with that have the diagnosis had that at some point.
Right.
I think it's better to go through that fear and try to find somebody versus going, oh, it's probably going to be okay. Because the earlier you can start helping, the easier it is for the whole family, I personally think.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the first things we get kind of drilled into the two things we get drilled into our head, at least in pediatric training, is one is children are not little adults. That's number one. And then number two is listen to the mom because she's usually right.
Oh, I like that.
I'm not just saying that.
Yeah, there should be a bumper sticker that says that.
Yeah. But it really, so in that sense, when the mom has got that vibe that there's something that's not quite right, that you should listen to that and take that a little bit more seriously. And not to say that she's always right, and of course, but I think so. Yeah, if someone's still not getting satisfactory answers, and there's that little something that's inside that doesn't feel right, and if your doctor is not giving you the answers that you need, then I think you do your child a disservice if you don't seek a secondary opinion.
And now, what do we do now for those that they get the diagnosis, they don't really know where to turn because, not everybody goes to a M.A.P.S doctor, right? For those that are watching, M.A.P.S stands for Medical Academy Pediatric of Special Needs. These are doctors that are trained specifically in helping a diagnosis such as autism, right? They have extra training, extra fellowship, and such. Often, though, many people get the diagnosis and they might go to their general doctor that doesn't have any special training. They don't really know where to turn them other than to maybe a school. But there's so much more we could be doing in that time frame. So what are the first steps you would recommend for a family who just gets the diagnosis?
Sure. So I think number one thing is important is understanding that even if you don't have a diagnosis specifically, but you have a lot of signs and symptoms that might be suggestive of a diagnosis, or is it autism, or is it pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, or where we're still kind of in limbo. I've had parents that have waited, and I don't think that you need to wait, because one of the things that's an important thing to understand, what M.A.P.S doctors do, is that we are not treating autism. Okay, and I think that's a really subtle but an important point that people sometimes overlook. It's that what we're trying to do is basically look at various domains that the literature has shown that many autistic children have imbalances in. So that can be gut imbalances, constipation or bacterial overgrowth. That can be nutritional deficiencies, because these kids don't want to eat and they get into vicious circles with mineral and vitamin deficiencies. That can be seizures and seizure disorders. That can be mitochondrial dysfunction, and on it goes. So what doctors like us do, it's not that we're treating autism, is that we're trying to identify and treat mitochondrial dysfunction, gut disorders, the way that a neurotypical child would be treated as well, right? Just because a kid has autism or some similar diagnosis doesn't mean that they don't deserve their constipation to be addressed any more than a neurotypical kid would. It's just our children might have a secondary sort of behavioral component that comes as a result of the constipation and so forth. So I think the kinds of things that families can do, even before they see a M.A.P.S doctor, or if they can't get to one, I mean, I think number one is looking at organizations like yours, because with all of the information that's out there, I think that's a valuable resource, and it's free and it's available. And so that really can make our jobs much easier when maybe eventually they come and see us, because you can do a lot of the underlying groundwork. So I think one thing that is absolutely helpful for the majority of the kids, again, the classic gluten-free, dairy-free diet trial is, I think, very important to try, because for most of the kids it does help. Not always, but very frequently. I think cleaning up the diet and getting high sugars, quick carbs, food coloring, dyes, our kids are very sensitive to that sort of stuff. And when a child's diet is composed of mostly pro-inflammatory sorts of foods, that causes a lot of behavioral discrepancies. So I think those are very important. I think getting any unnecessary toxic burdens out of their house is very important. So if we're still using Roundup on the yard, if we're still spraying a lot of various highly perfumed air fresheners, a lot of those kind of toxicants also add to the burden for a child. And so I think easy things like that, just cleaning up the environment, cleaning up the diet, and then you can do some simple things like, in conjunction maybe with your regular doctor, screening them for vitamin D deficiency, screening them for anemia, screening them for some just simple, a comprehensive metabolic panel, a CBC. It doesn't have to be extensive for the first pass, but those little things can add up when you put them all together. It's not any one thing, it's a lot of little things that come together that can cause things to come into better balance. And so those are usually good first steps.
And they're so common sense in so many ways, where you think, clean up the house, not using overusing toxins, or toxic type cleaners, the diet thing for me, it was such an easy choice to try, because I was on a waiting list to see a specialist, and I was not on a waiting list to go to the grocery store.
Right.
It was something easy that I could try, and he was 2.5. It was much easier for me to, he doesn't have a credit card, he didn't have a car, he wasn't making his own food choices,
right.
And so that's why I say the younger, the easier, but that doesn't mean that you can't do it at 52 or 32 or 22.
Right.
I think that at any age, if you learn something that could potentially be helpful, you should try it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can't sort of regret or lament the mistakes we made in ignorance of the past, right?
Absolutely.
But once we have the information, and then I think the hardest thing with the diet very frequently is that when a parent is reluctant to change the diet, it has a lot to do with the parent, because it challenges our own food beliefs, it challenges our cultural beliefs, it challenges our expectations around food, and that's an important part of culture. But and people, I think, misunderstand that, like, the food today is not the food of yesteryear, unfortunately. And so, it's a different day, and we can't get away with TV dinners and playing with liquid mercury and all the stuff that they did in the 60s. The way that they used to be able to get away with. So I think there has to be a paradigm shift, just in general, and understanding it's not just a bunch of hippies that are doing this, that it's our kids are vulnerable to this now, unfortunately, and we have to adjust.
Well, and I will say it's so much easier if you wanted to try the trial of the gluten-free, dairy-free diet today than it was even 15 years ago. Oh my goodness. I remember going to the health food market, and I hadn't been to that particular market because back then, if you wanted to try anything that was gluten-free or dairy-free, you had to go into a special market. It wasn't like you could go into a regular grocery store, and everything cost 10 times more. And there was no pre-packaged anything. So if you wanted to make, let's say, a gluten-free, dairy-free waffle, you had to buy like 19 ingredients. And I always joke about this. I think I must have burnt I don't even know, 12 different waffle iron, trying to make a waffle. They always turned out like bricks. They were awful. And today it's so much easier to be able to swap out different foods and to really still eat very healthy. Because I was such a horrible cook, I'm definitely not a very good cook. We stayed really in the produce and meat section for us because it was easier for me. I knew how to grab a vegetable and steam that, I knew how to buy a piece of organic meat. It wasn't that difficult. Trying to make something that was, fun, like a cookie, I wasn't that great at, right? So my son didn't grow up with all of that, and I can tell you that's possible. Although today we do it just like it's a treat. It's not like an everyday thing. So when I grew up, it was a treat to get a treat. It wasn't an everyday, of course you're gonna get a cookie. No, I don't remember getting, it was if I got a cookie, it was like, what? That's so cool. And so that's kind of how my son sees it now. But again, now I can buy stuff that is gluten-free, dairy-free, very low in sugar, if any, because now we have stevia and monk fruit and all this other stuff. And so, guys, if you're watching this, it's really not that difficult. And you don't have to go to a specialty health food store. You can go to almost any grocery store.
Absolutely.
And or you can even order online now. It's I wish they would have had this back then. It would have made it so much more simple. But
you just shop the perimeter of the store, as they say. And the old joke is if you have to ask if it's gluten-free, you probably shouldn't be eating it either.
Exactly. Because you pretty much know an orange is gluten-free. You know that a cucumber or a zucchini is gluten-free. And so again, guys, these are easy steps for people to take.
Absolutely.
And that's especially while you're waiting to see a specialist. It's not that difficult. And the most difficult part, as you said, is changing that belief.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, so how do people find you?
So I'm here in Southern California at Rossignol Medical Center. And so it's easy to find. It's rossignolmedicalcenter.com. And, you can call. We have an availability. You just call and make the appointment. We have you fill in the paperwork, and then we can get you plugged in relatively quickly. And we can start the journey and get going. And, the one thing that I do want to make sure that, parents do always keep in mind, especially as parents are kind of coming into this journey, I think one of the biggest misunderstandings that new parents do have that, you guys say it over and over and over again, but I think it bears repeating, that it is a marathon and not a sprint. And that it does take time to sort of figure this out, because a lot of people come in and they're like, okay, well, what's the cause of my kid's autism? And I try to explain to people it doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, if it were that easy, it would have been solved a long time ago. It's a lot of different moving parts simultaneously. It's a puzzle. I mean, that's why the puzzle piece is used as the symbol. And what may be true for one family, it may not be true for another family. We can do the identical intervention for this child, and it's fantastic, and it does nothing for this kid. And that's very frustrating for families, and it's frustrating for us as well. But it's a journey worth taking. And so I think if you can just kind of do that and understand that it's going to take some time and it's going to take a little bit of doing, but not to give up hope. It's definitely doable. I mean, we get kids so much better, and even if maybe they're not 100% recovered, I mean, obviously that would be our goal naturally, but we can certainly make them so much more comfortable, their function so much better, life so much better for them in so many ways. So I think even if it's not always easy, it's definitely effort and time well spent.
Absolutely. And I love how you say, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And we do say that often in the community that, it's something that you have to learn us and we have to learn you, and the doctor has to understand, like, we have to do this test and then that test. And sometimes you might help one thing and then something else pops up and then you got to help that other issue that's going on. So, it's very complex. And we're so lucky to have doctors like you that are willing to not give up on us and try to figure out the answers to this amazing puzzle that looks like all blue ocean, all the same color, and all the same size.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for taking the time and
My
talking
pleasure.
with us. And
Thanks for
thank
having
you
me.
for everyone that's watching. Until next time. Bye, guys.